Good morning. I want to share that I'm with Russ Harding, EQengineered's .NET practice lead and one of our principal consultants and architects, and Julian Flaks, EQengineered CTO. Thanks for joining this morning, guys.
Good morning.
Julian, I'm going to start with you. We've been asked several questions from our clients and prospective clients lately, and as we focus on modernization, I thought to ask if you could share several considerations that you think they should be aware of as they consider Java-focused technology.
Well, that's interesting. Java technology, as you know, we're dealing on both sides of the spectrum with the Microsoft and the open source stacks, and there are some nuances that hit that Java ecosystem. I feel like just like there are more patterns and more things happening in the industry, like there's more choices than ever with Java, and sometimes choice is good, and sometimes it's a lack of constraint that can point people the wrong way. The JVMs have become more complex now that licensing issues have started to bite people from their regular go-to, and Amazon's Corretto and OpenJDK have really filled that void. Frameworks are one of the biggest ones to come to, but even at the language level, we've got new patterns kicking in where Java was always slow to catch up, kind of took a pride in how slow it was to evolve, and now it's really trying to be up there with every other language. And some of those patterns are very powerful, and I think as people modernize, it's important not just to think they're just going to change the dependencies, but to make sure their patterns are something everyone can feel good about and energized about in the code. The ones I'm thinking of are just the asynchronous patterns. We've had async servlet for a while. We've got the completable futures, but also the streaming API. It really changes the game for how some of the nuts and bolts are done down within methods. Within frameworks, it's an interesting story. We have one huge behemoth in the form of Spring that has been managing to stay ahead of the game. It's still over 50% usage. But in the microservices space, some people are definitely getting traction with things that are newer, faster to get kicking off on a new instance, and just more adapted to the microservice world. And frameworks are one of those very strategic questions, because depending on how tightly you couple to them, depending on how long the support cycle lasts, or even without the support, just how long their popularity in the community lasts. There's real long-lasting wins and losses that can be made by your choice there. I think with that, the usual things apply. I favor the long cycle of Spring, but just be very aware, if something's only been popular in the last year, maybe you'll find people trying to understand it now and add it to their resumes. In 2 years' time, it may be something nobody particularly wants on their resume, and it'll be harder and harder to find internal or external talent to help you out.
That's great. Thanks, Julian. Russ, kind of in the same vein, I know you're doing a lot of work with .NET and .NET Core 3.0. Wonder if there are several lessons that you think we've learned that might help technical organizations that are looking to modernize their Microsoft technology stack and direction.
Yeah, I think there's a few things to keep in mind. But first and foremost, that just from the amount of work required in order to convert from .NET to .NET Core, if you have a really older legacy application that has been very feature focused for some time, the transition from .NET to .NET Core is going to probably require a bit of work. So definitely think about that as you start to map out that roadmap a little bit, because the patterns, the flexibility that .NET Core brings to the table, the way that it handles a lot of the dependency injection and the other components of it, especially middleware is concerned, is different than the .NET framework. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, that this isn't going to be something that you're going to be able to just change the project file and move over in a sprint or maybe even two. You're probably talking a couple of 3 months worth of work if it's a really big application that hasn't had a lot of technical debt work. This is also a good opportunity to take a look at some of those third-party libraries, because a lot of them, as we are working on some of the projects that I've been working on, Some of those libraries have gotten older. Some of them are not necessarily compatible with .NET Core, especially if you're starting to think about .NET Core in the vein of, well, it now supports multi-platform. So if I want to be off of a Windows platform, do those third-party libraries that I'm using, are they licensed to be used on these other platforms? Are they even compatible with these other platforms? So that's work that you could potentially do ahead of time before you even make the switch over to .NET Core, and get yourself ahead of that a little bit and give yourself some real clear milestones as you're working through this. Some of the other things that once you get into .NET Core, you'll start to notice is that it's much more modular, much more flexible than the original .NET framework. It makes much more native use of dependency injection. You don't necessarily have to, but it is a big component of the .NET Core. And it makes it very easy for you to be able to very quickly build and integrate your own components into the various pieces of the pipeline, whether it be in your middleware, your authentication, whatever it happens to be. And also allows you to potentially pull in and replace components of .NET Core itself. So the dependency injection framework itself is one thing that comes to mind. You can actually replace the native one with a third party like AutoFac or something like that very easily. It's pretty much just one line of code once you reference the AutoFac NuGet packages. So things like that are very easy to do. You can switch out a lot of the native functionality very easily in .NET Core, especially if you have some compatibility or features that you need to have access to that third-party libraries bring to you that .NET Core isn't quite there yet. The other thing to kind of think about is, again, more of a philosophy is, pay attention to the different types of releases that .NET Core has. You've got your current release cycle, and then you have your long-term release cycle, and they generally are varying. So every other release is considered a long-term support, and those are going to obviously have support for much longer. But the current releases are generally only going to be good until the next release and then a couple of months. So .NET Core 3 is a real good example. It came out and really was surpassed by .NET Core 3.1 very quickly. And so now, even at this point, 3-4 months later, .NET Core 3.0 is not supported anymore. 3.1 is really the one to go forward. But those are some of the things that you should probably be thinking about up front. This is an opportunity to sit down and look at your technical debt, figure out exactly how you want to handle the application, and see how you want to bring it forward. What are your technology needs? What are your expectations over the next couple of years? And how do you really plan on using .NET Core? Do you want to be leading edge, bleeding edge, or are you okay with something that's, do you need something a little bit more stable that's going to have a longer term support pattern and much more flexibility that .NET Core brings to the table as well?
That's great. Appreciate that, Russ. Another common question that we get asked, and I'll open this up to Julian first, and then Russ, have you jump in, is how enterprises should be thinking about the front and back end tech stack as they modernize. You have any thoughts there, Julian?
Sure. I mean, there's been some long established trends that I feel have really come to fruition. I mean, one that a lot of places take as just a guaranteed now is the approach where we separate front and back end via RESTful interfaces. Every year or so, there's another technology that seems to try to backtrack on that and offer some relief to those that don't want to immerse into the very fast-changing architecture of the front-end world. But I don't think many people are buying into that as an approach. The two leading stacks we find at the moment are React and Angular, and they're very opposite. So finding a match between those two can be a very soul-searching activity. On the one hand, React is so unopinionated in many ways. It provides lightning-fast updates, a very minimalist approach, and it's great, but it gives you an open hand with which you can do good and bad things. Patterns become incredibly important there. You really need to make sure you're establishing that front-end technology roadmap and having people follow it. Angular is really the total opposite. It's very exciting that as we went from Angular 1 to 2, we had one very established enterprise heavily used framework actually coming with an upgrade path to something that was substantially better and renewed over the original. That's something that doesn't happen too often in the front end. Again, I think it matters tremendously that teams have patterns they follow. JavaScript, even when you add TypeScript, which is something we believe firmly in, as something that provides benefits for type safety. Even with that, JavaScript is something where you can just have less code organization. You can have too many open questions left to the developer as they start on a new piece of work. And the more you can answer those with a repeated approach that everyone on the team can understand when they look at it for the first time, the payback from that is just immeasurable. The other thing I think is really worth calling out is that RESTful separation. There's a textbook answer, we've got RESTful endpoints. But as you get into front-end builds, you soon find you need to start optimizing pieces. You start to say, okay, Chrome's going to run out after n requests. It's going to get choked. Let's combine this data with this data to make sure our app gets the data it needs all in one place. I think my big caution there is just don't optimize prematurely, because the more you gear those data feeds to exactly the way your front end is built, the more coupled you are between back and front end. And if somebody does happen to rewrite this guy in 3, 4, 6 years, they might find those REST endpoints are kind of not what they needed anymore, because they weren't built to represent a transport of domain objects or a part of the domain. They were really geared to this look and feel of this page.
That's great. Russ, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what Julian said really follows through for the back-end technologies as well. I mean, if you're taking a look at building an application, premature optimization is definitely something that I've seen done over the years. It's I found in some of the previous work that I've done, different companies that I've done, that the teams can be separated, and there can be a bit of a firewall between them, between the front end team and the back end team, and there isn't really always good communication from even a product standpoint, right? Just a holistic, this is what we're ultimately trying to do. So the back end teams really don't necessarily know, and they end up building an API to what Julian was talking about, which might be really flexible, but giving you a lot of discrete pieces of information, but then really kind of causes some performance and performance anxiety in the front end, because you now have to have lots of chatty calls back and forth in order to get what you need. Incredibly flexible, but really inefficient for a particular goal that you're trying to accomplish. So having a good holistic sense of what you're trying to build is going to be important. And understanding the technologies that you want to use. What is your who's your audience? What are they expecting from your application? Are they expecting this is going to be a sub-second response time? Are you going to be doing with hundreds of calls a minute? Are you going to be doing hundreds of thousands of calls a minute? Right? How do you build that application in a way that actually is going to service your community very well? What are your perhaps cyclical events over the course of a year? Do you get really busy at Christmas? Around Christmas time for Black Friday sort of stuff? Do you get really busy more in tax season? Are you more of a travel site that's busy in the winter or the summer for travel, that sort of stuff? So where do you have your peaks and valleys? How do you build for that? Are you looking to move up into the cloud? Can you take advantage of separating, that redesign that comes along with it, right? Don't just think about necessarily lift and shift. Can you take advantage of the cloud technologies to be able to help you with those peaks and valleys? The different technologies that are available to be able to separate out your functionality so that you can actually be much more responsive to users, as well as to your front end team and any other teams that might be trying to consume your services.
That's a great lead into the next question that we often get asked, which is, how should organizations be thinking about design and design systems as they consider front and back end technology modernization? Wonder, Julian, if you had any specific thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Design systems are something which sometimes in the enterprise we definitely feel like we deal with the haves and the have-nots. Not because people don't think about it or don't have the awareness, but just who is their target audience? Have they decided that it's enough of a priority to put design high up in the goals? You'll hear things like, well, our product's definitely something everyone's trained on, for example, and it just changes that mentality compared to branding comes before anything else. Now we'll try and get the features to be as good as possible. And, a design system, when it's there, provides answers. It's a bit like the visual layers architecture. It's a way that people can be helped in the way they think about visual decisions. When it's absent, it leaves a big gap for people to fill when they get asked something very simple like, add me a message on this page, and they start thinking, okay, where should that be? What's the typography? What's the margin around this? Does it just have to look okay and kind of intentional, or does it have to fit in with some scheme? Especially now, as well as whether you have a design system or not, and that another trend has become agile as a productivity framework. It's become very common for there to be a stakeholder who in a very efficient way decides, yeah, I like the look of that. And sometimes they're thinking about things from that holistic point of view. Sometimes they're just thinking of their one feature and how do they imagine it in their heads. All these things are valid, and that whole emphasis of agile, of people versus processes, it can be counterproductive when you're trying to make something repeatable, something more holistic. And I think in modernization, this is hugely important, because in modernization, there is something that may be starting from a very disparate, less cohesive standpoint. It's quite common. It's your chance to harmonize things. But it's also a time when your developers are going to be under pressure to reproduce various experiences, to recreate various content. And without getting into the weeds of it, I believe HTML5 is something which brought in that notion we can structure our pages around the semantics of what are we building content-wise, what's our layout. And if people do that, it becomes much more flexible when it comes to people either bringing in a design system, iterating a design system, changing branding because something's changed organizationally. It's just a piece of our world that became very informed with CSS taking over from other approaches to layout. And sometimes efficiencies coming from the greenfield world can start to push that flexibility away. And I think it's very important people hold on to it. The other thing that comes to mind is people treating especially third-party component systems as a design system. I think that that's tremendously beneficial and energizing when you're in a greenfield environment and you have something to build fast, reach that MVP, prove it out. Maybe you don't mind there being throwaway. It's a little different when we're modernizing an enterprise app. We know that this thing's here to stay. We know there's a user base. You're probably going to be putting them through some pain anyway as you change your look and feel. There's a retraining, if you will, involved for people using that app. You don't want to do that too many times. You want to do this in a nice iterative way. And again, if you look at your system and it's not easy to make the look and feel match what marketing tell you it has to look like in a year, you've kind of been less flexible than you could have been.
That's great. Thank you, Julian. Well, the last question I'll open up to both of you. Maybe, Russ, you can answer first. But we obviously have a lot of enterprises that are thinking about modernization and whether they, and in most cases, frankly, iteratively modernizing versus rebuilding a large enterprise application. Wondered if you had any specific advice as they think about getting started.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that you can really do as you start to look at this. As I was starting to talk about earlier on, you've got your third-party libraries that in a lot of cases may be obsolete or may not necessarily be compatible with whatever platform that you're looking to move forward to, or maybe they just don't. they just need to be evaluated for various reasons. That's a place to begin. So you can really kind of take a look at your application in these different milestones, and you can start to take a look at these third-party libraries, update them, deal with that fallout, and any regression that may come as a consequence of that, and you can deal with that as a very clear milestone and in an iterative way. Another thing that you can do is .NET Core brings to the table what's called a .NET standard. So it's basically a common set of libraries that are shared between .NET Framework and .NET Core. And it actually will allow you to build some of your shared component libraries, not necessarily the EXEs or the ASP.NET website itself, none of these entry applications, but the shared libraries where you build your common functions, your common business layers, that sort of stuff. You can actually start to migrate those into what's considered a .NET standard library. And then this way you can actually use those in an interoperable way between your .NET framework and your .NET core applications, and that can kind of give you a little bit of a stepping platform as well, so you can move again in a bit of an iterative way. So you can say, well, I've moved all of my entity libraries over, and I've moved my data access layer or my caching layer, and it can be used in both the .NET Core as well as the .NET Framework projects. And then at that point, you can actually start to focus on maybe your actual entry application, whether it be your WPF application, which is now supported in .NET Core 3.1, whether it be your ASP.NET application, whether it be an MVC full stack application, whatever it happens to be. But you can kind of take these things and break them into different pieces, and just think about those different components. Other pieces is going to be a little bit more domain specific, but how do you have different layers broken out? Do you have a caching layer, and is this an opportunity to refactor that layer? And all of those different pieces and components are going to be a bit more, you said, industry or product specific, but you can definitely break your applications up into smaller components. And .NET and .NET Core really allow that to happen now, so that you can move these forward. Those are some of the things that really kind of just jump off the top of my head for me.
Thanks, Russ. Julian, I wonder if you had any thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've hit on some of these questions before, talking about frameworks, talking about the long cycle. One of the big pieces that leaps out to me is just how we think about maintainability. Actually, as we talk about some of those more legacy Java pieces, I was thinking back to how there was a state of mind where you'd put one of these in a server somewhere and you could kind of walk away and leave it alone. I mean, there's always some work to keep lights on, but on the other hand, you weren't going to have everything deprecate from under your feet within even 5, maybe 10 years. Now, these cycles, I don't know what started the trend, maybe Apple, maybe some of these leaders that have decided that they have to really keep change going fast, and deprecation's happening quicker. The front end feels it very painfully. It's just a fact of life. If you fall versions behind, you don't find your answers anymore. Your bugs might be yours, or they might be because you haven't updated. But over on the, in the Java stack, as I say, where you might have least expected to see it, suddenly the support cycles for versions have gone way down, and people are really feeling like they need to keep up with it. So there's a good and a bad there. I think it means that some of these giant modernizings of something that's really fallen out of use, out of understanding of the people working on it, those aren't probably going to happen quite the same. I think people are going to be forced to keep up with that as they get there. But that really promotes this notion in my mind of how are we thinking about the maintainability when we pick technologies? How resourceable is it now? How resourceable is it in 5 years' time? If you had to suddenly start supporting your own framework because nobody was actively maintaining it, is that something you can realistically do in-house? Even if it's a very small framework, you'll probably find this is beyond what you could afford to support yourself. And if you find yourself as the major committer of a project like that, that's a scary place to wind up in. I like to think of it as sometimes you'll have an architect or an engineer who's really enjoying a particular piece of the industry technology trend of the day, but it's not them that's going to be running with this. It's going to be a whole team of programmers for a long time to come. Remember, you're at the start of something, not the end of it, and plan accordingly.
I appreciate you both taking the time to share your experience and learnings, particularly around modernization and .NET, .NET Core, and Java. And thank you very much for the time this morning.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you.